Welcome to today's edition of Janus Academy. Today we have a new lecture dedicated to the series of historical analogies. This is the fourth lecture in line, and this one will be dedicated to a very dear topic, very close to me, very dear to me. This is a completely subjective thing, so I'm going to be enjoying talking about this. I've spent a lot of time dealing with both of these topics, with both of these eras that we're going to be handling in this particular analogy. Most of all, I've spent a lot of time dealing with Gothic style, because what we're talking about today is the relation between Gothic style and Impressionism. Now, we need to start by saying that Gothic style is a derogatory term. So it was never called Gothic style back in the day. We're talking about a style that was around from 12th to 16th century, that originated from France, from the suburbs of Paris, to be more precise, from the Cathedral and Basilica of Saint-Denis, Saint Denis. This was the first Gothic edifice in the world. And it is a properly French invention. This is something we're going to go back to. So is Impressionism. So the idea with this is that Gothic style was never called this. Why is this the case? So during the medieval period, it was known as Opus Francigerum, which means the French style. Now, it was named Gothic after the medieval period because this was supposed to be a pejorative, insulting term. And the whole idea with this is that this was supposed to label a style that is not harmonious, that is not balanced, that is overblown, that is downright ugly. It was named after Goths, people who were seen as vandals, that were seen as barbarous, people who sacked Rome more than once, and people whose very existence was seen as adversary and as entirely foreign to everything that had to do with classical antiquity and with antiquity in general. They were truly seen as one of the leading causes of the downfall of Rome. Whether this was historically accurate or not is not really important for the moment. So the idea is that Goths and all things Gothic have to do with a group of people, with style, with culture, with civilization, if you will, that was seen as Christianized after a certain moment, but barely and incompletely so. So they were basically almost civilized or barely civilized. And this was the entire idea, that they were seen as destroyers of civilization rather than carriers of civilization. So you can see that this is a very harsh judgment, aesthetical and cultural. This was made after the medieval period ended. And this was driven from a very particular worldview that posits that true beauty only comes from classical antiquity, that it only comes from Greco-Roman context, or to be more particular, to be more precise, from Greek context. So anything that did not come from this, anything that was not a fruit or a branch or an elaboration of this particular tradition, was seen as downright ugly, unbecoming. So Gothic style was seen as such. People who labeled it as Gothic failed to understand or did not bother to think about the fact that this style was an elaboration of Romanesque style, that it came from an already existing style that was indeed very Roman. We were talking about this in one of the previous lectures. Not that it was Roman, actually it was a branch of Roman style. It was a development of already existing Roman style. So you could say that in this particular manner, Gothic style is very close to Impressionism, because when Impressionism appeared, it was also seen as ugly, scandalous, difficult to understand, completely foreign to what art was. Because what art was in the period of then dominant neoclassicism, art was seen as skill, as elegance, as a technical mastery. And you could argue that Impressionism was exactly the opposite. It was opposed and downright directly opposed to all of these notions. A lot can be said about the difference between neoclassicism and Impressionism. A lot of these differences were downright intentional. People that were creating in style of Impressionism was quite intentional and were quite deliberate in not creating paintings following neoclassical rules of beauty, of harmony. So you could argue that some of these people, like a very famous example of Monet, were academically trained, were incredibly talented. So the question wasn't really their lack of skill, it was their very deliberate decision not to create paintings in the style that the world expected them to. So you could argue that this would be one of the similarities between these two styles, the fact that they were scorned and they were not accepted as aesthetically worthy. The difference, of course, being that Gothic style was deemed as such a posteriori after it had already ended or after it had existed, whereas Impressionism was seen like this when it appeared, but then later slowly gained claim. Now I want to go back to this connection, the original connection between these two styles, that I personally see them, and comments are welcome on this, but I'm personally persuaded that these are the only two French inventions when it comes to history of art. Now, I want to explain this a little bit. I want to state that French people throughout history of French art, French visual arts, but literary arts not that different, they have imported a lot. They have imported a lot from Italy. Almost everything, really. So they don't really have a lot of invention going on. French people are very good at perfecting things, but not quite as good at inventing things. So if we are looking at Gothic style and Impressionism, we're truly talking about the only two eras that were truly invented by the French. If you think about the French Renaissance, they have adopted that from Italy. Neoclassicism came from Italy. Baroque came from Italy. Not to go any further with these examples, you could argue that French classicism was an adaptation of the Italian Renaissance and was a response to Italian Baroque. So not really an invention per se. Now, if we want to split hairs, and we do, we can say that Gothic style was not entirely an invention. It was not entirely inventive because it relied on two techniques, two very important technologies that were imported from the East, from Arabic architecture. So we are talking, of course, about the technology of stained glass window, indeed the recipe of creation of stained glass window, and we're talking about the broken arch. These are the two fundamental aspects of Gothic art and of Gothic architecture. So these also were imported, but you could argue that in Arabic architecture they were never put together, never used quite in the same manner as they were in Gothic style. So I personally feel like we can actually talk about Gothic style as an invention. Now, when we're talking about this, we need to also make another little analogy, a mini analogy within an analogy, analogyception, if you will. And it has to do with origin of these styles, with styles that were previously around. So you could argue that Gothic style emerges from Romanesque, not that you could argue this is factually the case, and you could argue that Impressionism emerges out of Neoclassicism. Doesn't really emerge as much as opposes itself directly to it. So it's directly made to be against Neoclassicism. But we could also say that Neoclassicism, chronologically speaking, comes before Impressionism. So we have this connection, Romanesque Gothic on one end and neoclassical Impressionist on the other. You could say that a very good example of this is present in the Orsay Museum. When you go there, the very beginning of their collection at the ground floor presents you with the room where you can see neoclassical school on one end and romanticism on the other. So you can see Ingres and you can see Delacroix. So you can clearly see how Ingres was invested as the pinnacle of neoclassicism, or academism if you will. He was invested in very strong linearity and very clean design, very accurate and well organized color harmony, whereas on the other end you had Romanticism and its aesthetics that was very wild, unruly, that did not invest itself into drawing at all. Actually, there was almost no drawing. Colors were very, very rich, they were very vibrant, and everything looked more like a sketch than it did as a painting. I mean, again, being seen from the neoclassical point of view. So you could say that this is a mini analogy within an analogy, that we have Italian origins of something that later becomes French art and French expression. So Romanesque style on one end, then Gothic as an elaboration of the Romanesque style. On the other, we have Neoclassicism, and within it, we have the emergence of Impressionism. So we also said, and we're going to say it a couple of more times, that Neoclassicism was around this style throughout the duration of Impressionism. So even after Impressionism pretty much ended, we still had neoclassical style around. We had it pretty much up until World War II. So it's not like neoclassicism ended and Impressionism began. Not at all. They ran alongside for quite a period of time. You could say this on the other end about Romanesque and Gothic style, and you can say the same thing about Gothic and Renaissance styles. So we want to go back to not only to the fact that these were the only two French inventions, and not only to the fact that they were heavily connected with already existing Italian styles. We want to go back to this whole idea of why these styles came in the first place. The fact that they were both revolutionary, downright so, that they wanted to bring something new, and that they were able to bring something new. When we're talking about novelty and invention that these two styles brought, we're going to be addressing the visual aspect of this situation, and we're going to be addressing the spiritual aspect, which I think may be even more important. When we're talking about Gothic style, this is very clear. People are very aware of the spiritual dimension of this particular aesthetics because we mostly find it in churches, and we mostly find it in cathedrals. So this is very easy to understand, but it's not as obvious with Impressionism. And this is something that may be the most interesting part of this presentation, because I will posit that there is a very strong and very serious, very profound spiritual dimension of Impressionism that is very easy to omit, because we mostly tend to see this style as very middle class, very bourgeois, very secular, because indeed it is all of these things, but it's not only these things. It's a lot of other things as well. This was very poorly worded, but what are you going to do? So I find it interesting and somewhat ironic that when we're talking about the revolutionary nature of these styles, we are talking, of course, about the great changes that happened in society. We're talking, let's say, about Impressionism first, the fact that it emerges in the revolutionary society. Now, I'm not only talking about France in regards to the Great French Revolution of 1789, because you could argue that Impressionism emerges decades after this. So we're really more talking about the 70s of the 19th century. We had some antecedencies. We had the plein air school. We had realism paving the way for Impressionism, but let's situate it at the 70s and 80s of the 19th century. This is the safest thing to do. So when we are talking about the French Revolution, we are truly talking about plural French revolutions. We've had more than one. There was also the Revolution of 1830. There was the Revolution of 1848. Finally, there was the Revolution of 1871, the Parisian Commune. So you could say that Impressionism emerged in a very politically unstable society. It's very far from the situation that it was decades and decades removed from the revolution. No, it appeared in a society that was very much still living the consequences of these revolutions, and in a society where another revolution was always just around the corner. It's not like these people said, okay, we're done with our revolutions, we know that we're not going to have any more of those. Far from it. They expected another one anytime now. And you could argue that while Impressionism was still developing, while it was still present, another great historical calamity happened. This was, of course, World War I. So you could say that from Parisian Commune in the 70s to World War I, this was truly a very troubled period. If we go back to the origin of Gothic art, 12th century, we can say the same thing. We had the Crusades in full swing. We had the church fighting for dominance with local aristocracy, with local kings. French kings were famous for always trying to squeeze more power out of the papal office. A lot of French history really is marked by French kings trying to gain more power from the Pope, to enlarge their own domain and to enlarge their own authority at the expense of the church. So this was an unstable situation per se. And it was a very precarious situation. So it's a situation where church is nowhere nearly as strong as we think that it is. This is a very broad, very particular topic. We're not going to go into this. So what I want to address now is a very, very important aspect, something that we could spend hours and hours talking about, and we shall, but in a different context. This is the relation between technology and art. Now, we already addressed this partially when we spoke about prehistoric art in different courses. mostly dedicated to history of art, but it's a very peculiar question here. We could say that these two inventions, Gothic art and Impressionism, there are centuries separating them, are both very much influenced by technology. They were profoundly influenced. Indeed, they were conditioned. Yes, these two styles were conditioned and made possible by technological invention. So we said that on one end we had Gothic style that was made possible by the usage of broken arch and by the usage of stained glass window, which were both very advanced technologies for its time and even for today. Creation of a stained glass window is actually a very difficult process, chemically very advanced process. On the other end, we had the fact that Impressionism was defined, really, not only conditioned, but truly defined and profoundly shaped by the invention of photography. If you think about photography, you're thinking about an image that is made by a machine. A fairly simple mechanism, really. So we're talking about an invention of a film that reacts to light and that is impressed upon by light. So when we say photography, we're truly using two Greek words, photos and graphene. Photos means light. Graphene is the verb to write. So literally, we're talking about writing down with light. And we're talking about an image that is created by light. So this helps us to understand why Impressionism is so invested in light, why it is all about light. Truly, light is the most important aspect of Impressionism. Conversely, you could say that light is also the most important aspect of Gothic style, and there is no denial of this, there is no discussion. If you go inside any Gothic church, especially a Gothic cathedral, you see that it's all about volumes of light. You see that volumes of light dominate the interior, and that most of these churches, if not all of them, indeed have more glass than stone. They have very, very large windows. They are entirely dedicated to light. Light is the most important symbolical, visual, and even structural aspect of all of these churches, especially if they are cathedrals. I would just like to point out that there's a difference between a church and a cathedral. Cathedral is the seat of a bishop, or in the case of many French churches, an archbishop, whereas a church is ran by a priest. So cathedrals are next level churches in terms of administration and many other things. We mostly associate them with size. They don't necessarily have to be large or larger, but in most cases they are. So when we're talking about Gothic churches or cathedrals, we're truly talking about booming presence of light, and we're talking about symbolism of light. So we are talking about the fact that it is through light that we see the image of heaven on earth, and that we see a world as a better place. We see world perfected. We see colors perfected through the usage of stained glass windows. When you're looking at Impressionist paintings, you see the very same thing. You see that they're entirely dedicated to light, that these people do not paint objects, they paint light and how it interacts with objects. So Monet was very explicit about this when he said that he wasn't painting objects, he was painting air between himself and the object. So he was indeed painting everything else around the object. And everything else around the object is light. What is air filled with? It's filled with light. It's flooded with light. So this is something that will take development of art in a very different direction. It will take it into basically neo-impressionism and pointillism. This is something that we're going to be discussing next. And this is another very interesting take on things. So you could argue that both of these were made available through technology. You could argue that influence of photography was profound because you had this machine, a fairly simple apparatus, that was able to create images incredibly quickly, incredibly cheaply, really, as compared to a living person that would have to go through the Academy of Fine Arts in most cases. They would have to be talented to begin with. Then they would have to train and practice and understand the anatomy, understand space, understand light, all these things. So then, of course, they would want to monetize their knowledge and rare skill. You didn't need to bother with any of this when you took a photographer, when you went to a photographer, when you wanted the photography done. So you could have a very realistic image of yourself or any other thing done quickly, cheaply, efficiently. And an even better thing, you could infinitely copy it. You could develop many different photographies from one single film, which is still the case for people who use films who do not use digital photography. So you could say that the Impressionists were then hard-pressed to deal with this and to make themselves relevant still. They were pushed to think hard about how they were going to make themselves still needed in the world of art, because they understood that creation of realistic images was completely monopolized, completely taken over by photography and by photographers. Now, any comparison with current period is, of course, not only welcome but obligatory. We are living in a period where artificial intelligence and its genesis is creating a lot of artificial art very quickly. Not to say very cheaply, it actually costs a lot of money, but not necessarily to its users. So the whole idea is that Impressionist painters were facing a very similar dilemma to the one that painters are facing today. And that is, the dilemma is, how are we going to make ourselves needed, useful, and necessary as artists in the world that is more and more dominated by technology? So this is the answer they found. This is what they had to offer to the world. They wanted to make their art more spiritual and less material. They wanted to make it more subjective. They wanted to say, okay, we can offer something that machine does not have. Machine does not have a soul. Machine is a simple apparatus, but we have not only a soul, but a subjectivity. Now, what I just said is not entirely true. We need to be careful about this, because we're going to be talking about man as machine a bit later. We're going to be talking about soul in a very peculiar manner. But for the moment, we can say that they wanted to offer subjectivity, something that machine did not yet possess. So machine was objective. It gave renderings of reality as it was. They wanted to offer something else. And this is the reason why we call the entire style Impressionism to begin with, because it's all about impressions. It's all about subjective takes on reality. Now, on the other end, you could argue that what happened with Gothic art was that they've incorporated the technique, two techniques, that allowed for a lot more light inside the church. If you ever visited a Romanesque church, even a very large one, you saw that they have very dark interiors. They have fairly small windows. And that experience of a mass, or experience of just being in one of these churches, is very, very different than the experience of being inside a Gothic church or a Gothic cathedral. So what was made available through technology was a completely different take on the mass, was a completely different understanding of what the church was, of what religion was, of what Catholicism was. We are talking about a very peculiar brand of Catholicism, Marian Catholicism. There's a lot to be said about this. The idea was that technology made religion completely different by offering a very, very different experience that was far more personal and far more sensual. It opened a completely new realm of understanding. It opened up a completely new way of seeing the space as spiritual and literally, directly, visibly infused with spirit, profoundly infused by sunlight. And this is a very important thing. So we have this connection that we made between spirituality and technology, and this is something that is really really important for both of these styles. So we are talking about the connection between the medieval period and the industrial period. Now, we know that the 19th century is defined by science. It is the century of science. It's the century of the scientific method, the century of scientific discoveries, of industrialization, of great breakthroughs, arguably much greater than were ever made in the 20th or even 21st century. Let's leave that aside for a moment. But it is really the century of all of these things, and it's a breaking point. It's an opening of a new era. The Industrial Revolution is in full swing. If we go back to the 12th century, when Gothic style emerges, we're talking about a very similar thing, because we have this immense change happen in the world in the 12th century. A lot of this is brought about by Gothic style. So if you want to imagine yourself being around in the 12th century, you have a habit of going to, let's say, Romanesque churches that are very small, that are fairly cramped spaces, that don't have a lot of light. Your experience of a mass is really very much like being in a cellar. And your visual and sensual experience of the church, of mass, and therefore of lived religion, is a fairly dark, claustrophobic, even tight, reduced experience. Now, you compare this with going to a Gothic cathedral or a Gothic church, but let's say a cathedral so that we can make this comparison more dramatic. You see incredibly tall ceilings. You see booming volumes of light. You see light of many colors. You hear the music. You feel the frankincense. It's a completely different experience. It opens up your mind. It opens up your spirit. You're truly transported to the realm of higher truths, of higher beauties, of higher existence. You have this idea that light took your soul and brought it closer to God. For those of you who think I exaggerate, I invite you to visit any Gothic cathedral on a sunny day. You will see what I'm talking about, especially if you look at the rose window, and especially if you decide to spend some time in the Gothic cathedral when it's a sunny day outside, and especially if you decide to partake in a mass. So these are truly phenomenal experiences. Even if you're not religious, even if you're not just Christian, but belonging to any of the Abrahamic religions, even if you decide to observe this purely aesthetically, purely as an experience, deprived of any spirituality, it is phenomenal, it is deeply impressive. So, with that in mind, we turn our attention to the question of the spirit, which is really, really important. So you could argue that Gothic style was doing all of the things that we just said it was doing. It was opening up our spirit, it was elevating our spirit closer to God. And it was doing so mostly through light. So it was doing so through visual devices by using very large windows that were flooded with sunlight and that were colored in many different colors that would then reflect themselves upon the interior of the church. So you had this idea of garden. Well, not necessarily Garden of Eden, scratch that. You had this idea of paradise, of heaven being brought down to earth. And you had the idea that you were uplifted and that your spirit was opened with this experience. Now, how does this compare to Impressionism? We say this style is very decidedly secular. It's very decidedly bourgeois. It's industrial. It's very much made to be understood and lived by the middle class people. And this is exactly what I'm talking about. If you're thinking about Gothic churches and cathedrals, you're thinking about the phenomenon that was called Liber Idiatorum back in the day, which means that this was the book for the illiterate. It was made in such a way so as to communicate religion to people who could not read or write or speak Latin, who could not read or write really at all any language, who didn't have access to the Bible. So we would use these churches basically as stone comic books, stone and glass comic books, where we would translate words to images. We would translate the book, meaning the Bible in this case, to images. And we used paintings, statues, reliefs, and most importantly, stained glass windows to communicate higher truths of the church dogma. So you could say that a very similar thing was taking place in Impressionism, because Impressionism was made for people who were not educated, who did not have a mastery of references of classical antiquity. If you're looking at, let's say, symbolist or romanticist or neoclassical, especially neoclassical art, you are looking at art that is very rich with references. You could say the same thing about Baroque to a certain extent, about Renaissance. Many of these works of art, many of these styles, indeed, were made for the elites in a certain way, especially after High Renaissance. So while initially these styles were used for churches, these paintings were made for churches rather than museums, we'll go back to that, a lot of symbolism was quite cryptic, and a lot of symbolism and layers of meaning in these styles, again, especially neoclassicism, necessitated an educated audience. Now, if we're talking about neoclassicism in particular, this is a style that comes, we already covered this, around the French Revolution and is adopted by the French Revolution as such. So it was not made for the churches, like is the case with Renaissance, Baroque, etc. It was made for museums, and as such, it counted on very educated audiences. So it was a higher middle class or higher class style. It had a lot of references, it had a lot of symbols that you needed to be educated to understand. Now, Impressionism is a very direct reaction to this. Impressionism goes against elitism in art, and it goes against this idea that you have to be an educated person so as to properly enjoy art. No, they want art to be understood by everyone. So when I say that it's a middle class art, I'm talking more about lower middle classes in many cases than about middle classes in its entirety. And so if you look at a lot of Impressionist paintings, you will see that they are dedicated to very banal affairs. They're dedicated to a train entering the station, or workers unloading coal from the barges, or sun rising or sun setting. Or one of the very famous paintings that is very humorous is a depiction of turkeys in Giverny, Monet's domain. So you will see a lot of banality, a lot of very ordinary scenes that have no deeper meaning. When Monet was asked what his paintings were about, he said nothing. They're images. Look at them, enjoy them as such. There's no hidden meaning, there's no hidden agenda. So the idea is that explicitly Gothic cathedrals were made for everyone to understand them because they invested so much in their visual communication. And they wanted to make the church dogma, which can get very abstract, very complex, very highbrow, they wanted to make it available to everyone. This was the explicit intent of Gothic churches and of Gothic style. They wanted to give you the experience of religion, even if you did not understand a single word of what the priest was saying. So I argue that they were very successful in this. Conversely, Impressionism did the same thing in its own right. Impressionist paintings were painting for the masses, if you will. They wanted everyone to be able to enjoy. They wanted the workers to be able to enjoy in their paintings. So you didn't need no education. You didn't need to read Latin or Greek to have read all of the classics to understand what the symbolism of the laurel leaf is, or what the name of a certain Greek god is, or what are the visual cues that help us recognize a certain god, or how do we play around with these symbols. You didn't need any of these. So you basically just needed to have a pair of fairly well-functioning eyes and you would be able to understand this. So Impressionists made it their task to have their paintings be all about light, and to be about light in a very peculiar manner, to deal with something that is very ephemeral, to deal with something that is very transitory. Now this is a very interesting thing, because the way these paintings were made was also very transitory. They made them basically to not last a very long time. Now, I said in one of the previous lectures that we've done that Impressionism was a terrible style, and I need to explain this a bit better. It's terrible only in terms of technology used. If you're looking at the classical technique of painting, you're looking at the fact that you have 7 coats of paint in many cases, that paint you use is made of organic pigment, which is in most cases made of minerals, of ground stones, and in some cases of plants, in some cases of insects or other living organisms, like sea mussels, etc. But yeah, in most cases these are minerals. So you have ground minerals turned to paste. You have 7 coats of paint that is made this way. This paint was made to petrify over time, to harden, and to basically protect the canvas from oxygen that would corrode the paint and the canvas from the inside, and would therefore threaten to destroy the work of art. If you have 7 coats of paint, if you make the painting be very smooth, basically as smooth as a mirror, you're sure that there are no cracks that are present. You are basically making a painting that can last for, let's say, up to 700 years without any serious maintenance work. Not so with Impressionism, quite the opposite. You have sometimes 5 coats of paint, sometimes 2, sometimes no paint whatsoever. If you look at a lot of Monet's paintings, I will give a couple of examples as we go, you can literally directly see the canvas. You can see that he went to no effort of covering the entire canvas. He was not making these to last. He was making these paintings basically to be used in the very industrial, not to say capitalistic manner, but it is very important to connect these things, because we are talking about the era of industrial capitalism. And this is something that is really important, because if we're talking about the medieval period, we're talking about a completely different mode of production. Now, I want to turn our attention to a very important series of paintings that were done by Monet. So this is the series of Notre Dame in Rouen. There is more than one of these. If you go to the Orsay Museum, in many cases you will see 5 of them, sometimes less. They're made to be one next to another. So this is basically a topic that brings together both of these eras that we're talking about. So Monet went through an effort of placing himself in front of the Notre Dame of Rouen, which is a Gothic cathedral, a monstrously large Gothic cathedral, and he made a series of what I think is 28 paintings. I was only able to find 20 of them, but I think the whole series is 28. Of course, I never got to see all 28 because they're scattered through private collections, different museums, they're all over the world. It would be an amazing thing to see them all together. Now, what is the deal with this? Monet was focusing on light, of course, and he was focusing on time. He was focusing on these two things, how they come together and how they act on the object at hand. The object at hand being the Gothic cathedral itself. Now, you can do a very easy experiment. You can get 20 of these paintings together through Google search. And by pure observation, you can see right away that these are very different paintings. They are always of one and the same thing, Cathedral of Notre Dame in Rouen. Sometimes he paints it from slightly different perspectives. He would sit 2 meters to the right or 2 meters to the left. In most cases, though, it's from the same point of view. So he made an effort of depicting this cathedral in different weather circumstances and in different lights. So he would present it in morning, at noon, in the afternoon, when it was overcast, during night, at dawn. Basically, 28 of these images were made one and the same thing in different lights, and he made 28 completely different images. You can see just how much these vary between one another. So what he was focusing on here was basically how light interacts with an object. He was focusing on the fact that light thoroughly changes an object, and that we cannot really talk about object having stable properties, having stable definitive colors or even a form without including light into this discussion. Truly, there is no stability of an object, because he's shown through his paintings that even an object that was made out of stone and glass, that took hundreds of years to be made, that was truly gargantuan, truly, and you have to see the size of this cathedral so to understand how large it is. So even an object of such magnitude and of such deep spiritual importance as is a Gothic cathedral changes all the time. So even this incredibly spiritual object was basically prone to constant flux, to constant shifting. And this is something that is very interesting, because Monet is arguing that not only that we see the world subjectively, that we see the world through our own eyes, mine are different to yours. Let's say that I have brown eyes, sometimes they turn green, they're mostly brown. If you have blue eyes, you will see the world differently than I do. You will see colors that I don't, and vice versa. So not to speak of different dioptries that you can have. If you have weaker or stronger eyes, you will see things differently. So the whole idea is that we see things differently. We perceive the world subjectively. But Monet went one step further, and he said, no, not only that you see the world subjectively, the world changes all the time. Everything is in constant flux. Everything is in constant motion. And light is there to show us this. Light is there to show us the cycle of the day. Now, how does this translate to Gothic art itself? Well, you can have the very same experience if you enter a Gothic church, and again, even better, a cathedral, and if you decide to spend the day there. Not to say that we haven't done this. So you spend some time, it doesn't have to be the full day, inside the church, and you observe lights and shadows. You observe how light travels. Sun rises in the east, it sets in the west. Throughout the day, sunlight is coming from different sources. So sunlight is animating the church from different perspectives, from different sources, and you truly see that the church has an interior life, that it's never the same. It always changes. It breathes, in a way, in its own rhythm. Now, I use the term animate very intentionally here because anima in Latin is the soul. So if we're talking about animation, we're talking about movement, we're talking about life. The fact that something moves, in many cases, indicate that it's alive. This was the logic of people that lived in the world before machines, or before autonomous machines, right? So they saw a movement as a sign of life. So you are to spend the day inside the church, you understand that it changes profoundly and that it's never the same. So you could say that Monet was doing this experiment from his own impressionist, arguably secular point of view, but he was indeed repeating an experience that was already around for hundreds of years. Experience that was available to any churchgoer who would decide to stay in a church during a sunny day, during a rainy day, during an overcast day. They could see the fragility of light, and they could see this amazingly spiritual phenomenon that light can be incredibly powerful, or it can be very fragile, it can be very fickle. So you see all of these things. You see a light that is responsible for all of life on planet Earth, that is responsible for the capacity of sight that we have. We see thanks to light. So this thing can appear as incredibly fragile, or it can appear as all-powerful. So it's easier to understand why in Gothic churches, light is basically a symbolical representation of Jesus Christ, who on one end is a God, a son of a God, who is the divine essence, God incarnate into a human being, but on the other end is also human. We know that Christ suffered immensely, that he was tortured, that he was crucified, he was murdered, so he felt pain as any other mortal man did. And this is the whole idea with the dogma that the church is trying to give us, that we understand that Christianity is not just about power, it's also about love, it's also about pain and fragility. Fragility of life, fragility of all of the human emotions that we have and of all of the human relationships. So it's incredibly powerful and it's incredibly fragile at the same time. And if you spend some time inside the church, you are made to understand this. And what Monet was doing, he was getting to this conclusion, again, from his own perspective. So yeah, I invite you to inspect the series of images, Notre Dame in Rouen by Monet. You can truly learn and understand a lot. Now, there's another thing to be addressed here. I want to go back shortly to this whole idea of spirit and matter. This is really interesting, and it's really important for both of these eras. So we have this relation of spirit and matter obviously poised so that the spirit dominates matter. This is a very medieval perspective, of course. We see spirit as eternal, we see the human soul as eternal, whereas we know that body is temporal and corruptible. We know that we grow old, we grow weaker, and all of these things. So in medieval terms, if you look at the interior and the exterior of a Gothic cathedral, you're truly looking at the fact that they are made to be pretty from the inside. They are made to be impressive from the inside, and they are made to show us supremacy of spirit over matter. Very clearly, you can see that interior of the church is made in such a way that you can see the stone ceiling without any actual supporting pillars. You can see the stone ceiling being carried by very large glass windows. So the impression you get is that the glass is carrying stone, which we know, of course, to be impossible. So you think that the light coming through these windows is actually carrying these stones. Symbolically, light stands for spirit, it's Christic presence. Stones stand for matter. So it truly feels, it seems, we get the impression that matter is being carried by light, and that matter is being dominated by light, that spirit dominates matter, that spirit is able to defeat laws of physics. It is basically able to make these stones levitate. So we're truly talking about supremacy of spirit over matter. And this is no surprise to anyone who is vaguely acquainted with Christianity. Spirit is more important than matter for all of the Christian denominations. Now, you have a very similar notion in not only Impressionism, but all of modern art. So we go back to photography and the fact that photography basically made a lot of art pointless. It made a lot of technique pointless. It made this whole notion of skill pointless. Why would we bother to learn how to draw and to paint and to master technique and to understand how to mix colors and to understand space and anatomy and all these things? This is a very technical skill. This is a very technical art. So why do we go through all this trouble if we can just push a button and have a photography ready? Now, of course, this is not to belittle photographic skill and photographic art. There's a lot more to it than that, but this is what it seemed like back in the day to the people, that the whole process of obtaining a photography takes hours, whereas the process of obtaining a painting takes days, weeks, months, sometimes even years. Now today, of course, this is even easier. We all have smartphones. We can literally just push a button and get a very realistic image of whatever we want. So the idea was that something else had to be the object of art. Something else had to become the main aspect of art, and this something was basically in the realm of the spirit. So you could say that art slowly started becoming more and more conceptual. So with Impressionism, we are truly talking about art that is increasingly conceptual, that is increasingly more about an idea, about a certain type of provocation, about a certain type of message. So it's less and less about technique, about something that is visual and therefore material. It's less and less about the actual skill you can develop with your hands, and it's more and more about your spirit. It's more and more about your mind. You are communicating a completely different type of message. So you could say that art, up until the discovery, the invention rather, of photography, was mostly about your hands. When I say hands, I mean metaphorically organs that you use as tools, that you can infuse with a lot of skill, skilled fingers like a surgeon or a pianist or a painter would have. So art is no longer about that. It's about your mind. It's about the new ideas, innovative, provocative concepts that you can get. And you can see how this dichotomy, mind versus matter, or spirit versus matter, if you will, is present in the medieval period and is present in the modern period. So it's present in the industrial modernity. So you could say that a lot of industrial modernity truly is fundamentally medieval in this particular regard, if we want to look at it from this point of view, if we want to look at it through the prism of relationship between spirit and matter. And we can also say that a lot of this, and this is not an accident, a lot of the industrial modernity is neo-Gothic, is Gothic revival. We have an entire courses dedicated to this. So it's this idea that Impressionism really wants to communicate a certain message rather than to be focused on the material skill. And if you look at, let's say, neoclassical paintings, this is the most important comparison to be made, because again, Impressionism goes intentionally against the salon, intentionally against academism. Neoclassicism, it is a combative, revolutionary style that is aimed against all of these things. You can say that any of these paintings take a lot more time, a lot more skill, a lot more effort than most Impressionist paintings do. Some of the Impressionist paintings, the most famous ones that we know, were made in hours. There's no neoclassical paintings that were done in hours. That doesn't exist. Whereas some of the masterpieces of Impressionism were done sometimes in hours, sometimes in days. The whole idea was the technique that was available to these people, and the impression they were after would not allow them to work on paintings for more than hours, because what they wanted to do was to capture the moment. They wanted to capture a certain type of light and how it interacts with objects, with colors, with forms around it. So, back to Monet's experiment with the Gothic Cathedral, Notre Dame in Rouen, this is exactly what he wanted to make us understand. He wanted to make us appreciate the passing beauty of a given moment. He wanted to capture the light as it was in that particular moment, because it's never going to be the same. And you can see that he's doing the same thing in many other paintings. He's capturing moments. Time is really, really, really important here, because he is keenly aware of time. If you're looking at the light and how the light changes, you can see that it has a lot to do with time. Now, if you go back to the church and the medieval period, you see that the church is in its own right and in its own manner heavily invested in time, more so than Impressionists were, and in a very important manner. So you can see that in village or town churches, you always see the clock prominently on display. The church really wants to master time, not to say to manipulate time. That would sound very, very negatively. But the crown example of all of this is the fact that we count our time from the birth of Jesus. If you were to be asked what the day is today, what the year is, you would say it's the year of 2025, the time when I'm recording this video. 2025 years from what? From birth of Christ. We know that the planet Earth is older than 2025 years. We know that certain civilizations measure time to go further back than 2025 years, but we have decided that this particular moment is so important, is so pivotal in our history that we're going to count our time from it. And you can argue that the church really dominates this decision. It was their decision to be made in the end. So you could say that the way that time is important for the Impressionists, it's also even more so important for the church. So when we are looking at light, we are truly looking at yet another way of understanding time. Because again, if you're looking at the cycle of the day, you can see that light comes from different sources. This is why we have sundials back in the day. The clocks that really use light to tell time. So you could say that it's an interesting thing, it's an interesting analogy to be made that these churches, Gothic churches and cathedrals, were made to last forever. I mean, when I say this, I want to say that this was the ambition of their constructors. They were made with great materials, with quality materials. They were mostly made of stones. Stained glass was not painted, it was stained, which means that they placed shards of different metals into molten glass so as to achieve different colors. If they painted the glass, this paint would evaporate, it would scratch over, it would never last quite as long. But what they were doing, they were profoundly changing the very nature of glass, and they were truly making this glass become green or yellow or blue or red, etc. So the idea was that they used high quality materials to make these churches last for, well, I say forever, it's a bit metaphorically, but as long as humanly possible. So it's an interesting thing to say that on one end, these churches were made to last forever. On the other end, we have Impressionist paintings that were made to not last a very long time. The technique that was used was intentionally shoddy. It was an artistic expression. Making them be poorly made was a very intended effect. It was something they truly wanted to be done this way because, again, most of these people knew how to make a painting. It's not that they didn't. They were academically trained painters, so they had the technique, they just refused to use it. But the point is, although these churches were made to last forever, and these paintings were explicitly made not to last longer than decades, and museums that feature them go through elaborate efforts in making them stay together and not fall apart, they went after the same impression. They wanted to deal with light. They wanted to deal with how light interacts with objects. They wanted to inspect the spiritual quality of light. They wanted to understand what light brings to humanity, how light interacts with colors, how it interacts with forms, how it interacts with matter. Now, you could argue that Impressionists were perhaps more inquisitive about this in a scientific manner. They wanted to understand the world through the prism of great scientific discoveries that were being made in the 19th century, whereas the medieval Gothic people were mostly invested in this spiritually. They saw that spirit permeated matter and that spirit ennobled matter. So this is what they were interested in. But you could argue that they were both invested in different emanations of the spirit. So whereas the 19th century, late 19th century people were invested in spiritual domains like science or applied science or research or invention or industrial advancements, all of these are fairly spiritual disciplines. So you can think of science as a very intellectual affair, and you can say that all of the intellectual work is mostly situated in the realm of the spirit. If you are an intellectual worker, you are not exactly a manual laborer. And we said that this art, this is very important, is the very beginning of conceptual art. This is the art that is the beginning of this idea that whatever new artist has to communicate, whatever new concept or fresh idea or provocation or a statement, be it political or cultural or personal, was more important than the actual matter. So you could say that both of these periods are very much invested in spirit rather than in matter. And both of them are invested in light. Now, to conclude this, although of course there's a lot more to be said on the topic, we need to say that both of these are very much solar in their presence. So these are not Chthonian material affairs, these are solar affairs. And the best way to understand this truly is to physically just observe a stained glass window. So look at the stained glass window on one end and then look at literally any Impressionist painting on the other. You will see tremendous visual similarities. You will see this idea that color is permeated by light, that light truly animates the image in front of you, that it gives it holiness in Gothic context and ethereal qualities in case of Impressionism. So you can see that they're looking at light while the light is looking at them. Monet and Sisley and Renoir and many of their colleagues are impressed, I mean, this is not a poor pun, I promise, by how light interacts with objects and how light envelops objects, and truly how light not really creates objects, but creates the possibility for us to observe it. And this is something they analyze. So if you're looking at stained glass windows and their color palette, you can pay attention at how light changes everything. If you look at a stained glass window without the sun behind it, you're looking at a very different image than when you're looking at a stained glass window when sun is going through it. Same thing goes for Impressionism. This is why most Impressionist paintings were made outside. This is why they made a point of leaving the studio behind. Impressionism came as a development of plein air painting. So this whole idea that you would leave your studio behind with all its commodities and facilities and your sketches and your easels and your assistants, all of these things you leave behind, you go outside, you only carry one small easel, a set of paint, a set of brushes, that's all you need. So basically you do this bare bone, ascetic almost painting, style of painting where you truly want to dedicate yourself to the light and you want to capture the light. If you want to capture the light properly, you have to leave the studio behind, because what you have inside the studio is artificial light. And what you have outside in nature is organic, natural light. So if you're thinking about the interior of a Gothic church, you're thinking about interior that truly functions with light. And again, visually, look at the difference and the similarity, but most of all similarity between a stained glass window that is flooded with light and then the Impressionist painting. You can see that they look very similar. You can see that the connection is very much obvious. This is even more so the case with Neo-Impressionism, with the development of pointillism. We can compare pointillism to panels of stained glass windows, but we're going to be doing a different thing. Instead of doing this, we're going to be comparing pointillism to Renaissance style. There's a lot to be said about that. So I hope you enjoyed this. Again, this is a topic that's very dear to my heart. The reason why this is the case, amongst other things, is because I wrote a book on Notre Dame, Fiat Lux Notre Dame. It's on the topic of Notre Dame de Paris, and it's soon going to be available on Amazon. So I could talk about Gothic art all day long, but I have to stop myself eventually. I wanted to invite you to think about the similarities and differences between these two styles that are separated by roughly 700 years. Or if you want to look at the end of Gothic style, you go back to the 16th century, so the gap is not quite as large. But the point is this, centuries separate these two styles, yet they share so much. They have so much in common. So if you ever think about an Impressionist painting when you're looking at a stained glass window, or if you think about a stained glass window when you're looking at an Impressionist painting, you'll make me a bit happier than I already am, and I will thank you for it. So yes, if you ever have the chance, please go and see the series done by Monet, Notre Dame de Rouen, and think about the info that we shared today. Thanks for your attention, and see you again soon. Ciao.